Hi everybody, my name's Elisa Kraut and I'm presenting What is the History of Knowledge in 2016, written by Peter Burke. Peter Burke's monograph, What is the History of Knowledge, explores not only the history of knowledge and information, but also the history of the study of knowledge. He makes a point of describing this in the plural, knowledges, histories. He makes a big point about that and says them often. I'm going to say knowledges and knowledge often during this presentation. But his focus is largely, though not exclusively, focused on European and Western scholarship and their colonialist influences, which I think is a bit of a blind spot, but I'll talk more about that later. Burke covers the evolution of the study of knowledge, the recent epistemological turn of the last few decades. This turn emphasizes the evolution of the study of the history of the sciences to the formalized study of the history of knowledge and information. Burke comes to the history of knowledge as the outgrowth of two scholarly traditions, history of the book and history of science. While this field appears to be a recent phenomenon, Burke goes so far as to state that he was one of the first to focus his studies on the history of knowledge. Burke identifies and highlights writings and scholarship from throughout recorded history to show the broadly held desire since the ancient Greeks to understand and build, as Enlightenment philosopher the Marquis de Condorcet described it, as an historical picture of the progress of the human mind. There are 4 chapters plus back matter, and the first chapter, titled Knowledges and Their Histories, is more like an introduction of the topic as a whole, and addresses the importance of the study of knowledge as a source of scholarly investigation. Burke cautions against parochialism in space as well as in time, in order to put the most recent knowledge revolution of the digital sphere in line with previous transformations. The following 3 chapters are organized like combination glossaries and case histories, with quotes and descriptions and book names, etc., highlighting scientists and scholars and their work. Through these short subsections, Burke introduces the ideas that explain how individuals and groups interact with, process, and change knowledge. The second chapter, Concepts, illustrates types of knowledge, and terms, and categorizations. Burke explains that hierarchies of knowledge are created as new methods develop. Burke quotes historian Harold Innis to explain that, quote, each medium of communication has tended to create a monopoly of knowledge, unquote. This pushes older technologies lower in the hierarchy, and that movement can also show itself, such as when, quote, ideas or methods current in one field and then are employed in another, unquote. Knowledge changes like these can show in the creation or decreased emphasis on certain disciplines, interdisciplinary work, and many other terms listed that you'll see on the next slide. So take a minute and just check these out. They're definitely worth looking up if you're interested, if any of them sort of trigger something in you. But I don't have time to go through all of them here. The third chapter, Processes, again sets up an even more detailed glossary of terms and explores them with brief examples of studies, scholarship, and outcomes, though the order of the appearance loses some of its careful alphabetic arrangement. Burke starts off talking about the history of objectivity in knowledge at different periods and the, quote, view from nowhere, unquote, which appears to be a phrase coined by philosopher Thomas Nagel in the 1980s, though he's not credited. Burke goes on to identify the 4 stages of information: gathering, analyzing, disseminating, and finally employing. This is the process of retrieving, categorizing, and preserving raw data in its raw stage and converting it into knowledge by cooking it through, quote, practices such as description, quantification, classification, and verification. That knowledge, now converted from data, starts to interact with and be in turn changed by society. Burke notes that the, quote, knowledge received is not the same as knowledge sent, unquote. It's a two-way street. Knowledge circulates and changes via discussion, travel, such as religious missionaries and colonialism, translation, which is often far from perfect, and by giving or restricting access. Finally, the knowledge product or idea must be used. Burke calls this the employing of knowledge, being used or misused. So here you can see some of the terms and descriptions that Burke uses that he considers processes and sections them out into those 4 stages. So again, take a minute and check these out. Some of them I felt got a little in the weeds. I felt like they were definitely, again, heavily Europeanized, which is not unusual, I think, considering Burke's extensive background. And I think this is a common situation. So he did try at times to include ancient Egypt and China, but those descriptions were often much fuzzier and included less sourcing. The final chapter, called Problems and Prospects, offers cautions for the social scientists studying knowledge. Burke cautions historians to avoid falling prey to a number of different isms: relativism, triumphalism, constructivism, and anachronism. As you can see, I talk about those a little bit here on this slide, and I'm just going to go into, just for a second, anachronism, for example, which is the attempt to translate knowledge between times and cultures, and Burke sees historians facing the difficult choice between fidelity to the culture that they're translating from and intelligibility to the culture that they're translating to. Burke tacks on a warning category called gender right at the very end, acknowledging rampant misogyny via disregard, reduction, and erasure of women from the record of created knowledge. But again, it's sort of almost like it's added on at the tail end, and he does mention different kinds of knowledges and different ways that women were involved in knowledge creation, but it's not as integrated throughout the rest of the book. So here we get to Burke's 3 prospects that he leaves us with at the end of the book. And I think that they're really interesting and something to consider and think on. Number 1 is the global turn, examining the broader world, quote, around encounters, clashes, translations, and hybridizations, unquote, of knowledge. And then there's the social turn, quote, employment of information not only by governments, but also by the governed, to vote, organize protests, to make revolutions, unquote. And I think we talk about that a lot in many of our classes about the public's role in knowledge creation and narrative and history. And then the increased focus on what Burke calls, quote, cognitive history, big or deep history, examining trends over thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, quote, collective learning on the part of humanity over the very long term. And I'd love to learn more about that. He didn't really go into that too much more, but it's something I plan to check out on my own. So at the very end, Burke urges historians to collaborate with archaeologists to dig deeply into these long-form patterns, to engage with a quote, archaeology of knowledge in the literal rather than the Foucauldian sense, which again, I found that a very sort of pithy turn of phrase at the end. There were 2 reviews of the monograph that show the book was generally very well received by the history field. Joan Judge for the Canadian Journal of History labeled this piece a slimmed-down version of Burke's 2-volume series, A Social History of Knowledge. Volume 1 was called From Gutenberg to Diderot, and Volume 2, From Encyclopedia to Wikipedia. That second volume was published in 2013. The overall review was pretty positive. However, Judge noted several errors or oversimplifications in Burke's efforts to include a brief history of knowledge from China, an example of where Burke's overemphasis on Western thought damages his premise a little bit. That said, Judge summarized the book as offering the reader a rich scholarly apparatus, detailed notes, a timeline of studies of knowledge, suggestions for further reading, and a comprehensive index, unquote. Renz-Bod's review in the Journal of the History of Humanities was fairly glowing, with the caveat that Burke's stunning and highly present read, unquote, errs on in the absence of connecting the history and philosophy of science and the philosophy of knowledge. Quote, "It's here that I believe Burke has missed an important chance. The history of knowledge is in fact directly relevant for and strongly connected to the philosophy of knowledge, better known as epistemology." Unquote. The glossary entries offered definitions of concepts and ideas via quotes and examples, knowledge sources from, as I've said a few times now, largely Western sources. Often there was an odd lack of sourcing and a sort of informal format that I wasn't really used to. Quotes were so liberally sprinkled through the book that while the myriad examples were really interesting, I sometimes had difficulty identifying Burke's reasoning and direction. While Burke was open about the Eurocentricity of his expertise, I still felt that he did not adequately address the harmful setbacks and erasures imposed on Western and global knowledge creation, perpetuated by colonialism, racism, and misogyny. Where Burke did excel was in offering a really kind of enjoyable introduction to the ideas and foundational thinkers who founded and developed the interrelated social sciences which formed the basis for the study of knowledge from the Renaissance through the 20th century. Likewise, he offered some enticing views into the future of the field, as knowledge and information are identified, uncovered, or reconstructed at an ever-growing pace in the information age. It's a solid starting point for which to begin one's exploration. So here are some discussion questions, and I've also put them in the discussion thread on Canvas, so you don't need to remember them here. But hopefully we'll have a good conversation, and I look forward to seeing you all there.